So before we get going with the gameplay tonight, I'm going to kind of talk about my theory on retro gaming in the modern age, and also kind of go into how I'm playing tonight's game. So tonight I'm playing what we know as Space Megaforce in the US, but I'm actually playing the Japanese version called Super Aleste, or you could call it Super Alesta, Super Aleste. I think the proper pronunciation is Alesta, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Regardless, it's a great game no matter how thin you slice it. And tonight I'm going to be playing on my trusty analog Super NT, which tends to be my console of choice for playing Super Nintendo games, Super Famicom games, at least when I'm upstairs here in my house. Um, I find it's great. You can output 720p or 1080p. I prefer 720p through HDMI to my 4K TV just because it scales cleanly. Also, it scales pretty well to my game capture device. Um, and one of the reasons why I'm playing the Japanese version of tonight's game is because it costs, even now, half as much as the US version of the game. You can find Space Megaforce for, I think, like upwards of 150, 160 and higher. I think Super Aleste right now costs like, what, 70, $80, which is still, I think, pricey for a game that was very highly produced, but it is a quality game. I think I bought my Japanese copy of the game a few years ago for like 30 bucks, 40 bucks. And because at the time, Space Megaforce was still getting up there in value. I mean, it's recognized as one of the best shoot 'em up games of all time, let alone on the Super Nintendo. So I get it. Uh, but I think one of the reasons why I think it's so awesome that systems like the Super NT exist or the Retron 5 or any of those, and even, you know, I won't call them emulation based, but FPGA type devices such as Mister. It's great that those exist because you can play these games on a very authentic. I mean, it's not the most authentic hardware, but you can play it, as close as you're going to get, while also still being able to output HDMI and have, the precise controls and everything, just the total package. And I think the great thing about these systems is that they let you play the Japanese versions of the games, the European versions of the games, the American version of the games. If you have a Mega SG, you might be playing Brazilian Sega Genesis games. I mean, things like that. Although I guess they call them Mega Drive games. Um, and I think it's just great. And that just gets into another of my philosophical ideas about retro gaming. And that's the idea that, you don't have to be limited to just your region's video games. If you're out there trying to buy physical copies, I totally get it. Owning a copy of a game like Space Megaforce or Super Aleste is awesome. It's great to have the physical cartridge in your hand, but maybe you don't want to shell out 150 bucks for the US version. Maybe you like Aero Fighters and you don't want to shell out $1,000 for the US version, which is ridiculous, by the way. I'm pretty sure somebody out there is just hoarding a bunch of these. But you can get the Japanese versions of these games cheaper. And if you have a system like the Super NT or a Retron 5 or any of those consoles, if their emulation quality or their FPGA quality is good enough, you can play the foreign games just as well as you can the US versions. And in a lot of cases, the Japanese games really don't have a lot of Japanese text, especially if you're doing fighting games, shoot 'em up games, things like that. Obviously, RPGs is a different story, but Super Aleste here, there is almost no Japanese text. The options menu, you can totally understand what's going on there. The cutscenes that are in the game, there was no text anyway. It's perfect if you want to get the cheaper version of Space Megaforce, get the Japanese version of Super Aleste, save yourself some bucks, and just enjoy the hell out of the game. Yeah, there are some changes here and there, particularly in the voice work, but some people might prefer the Japanese voices. So I think that's just my soapbox rant for the evening, is that I think it's awesome that in this day and age, we have systems and emulators and everything in between that allows us to experience these games. So if you do want to play the US version of a game, you certainly can. But if you want to, have the actual cartridge in your hand, maybe you don't want to be, restricted by the exorbitant cash prices that are charged for a certain region. Maybe the game's rare in the United States, maybe it's rare in the UK, but maybe it was overproduced in Japan. I think it's awesome that we live in a day and age where you can just go on to eBay or other sites like that and get a game for less than half the cost of the US version. That's what I did with Super Alesta, and I don't regret that one bit. So, with that said, I'm going to stop yapping and get on to the gameplay. All right, so as I said in my intro, this is Super Aleste for the Super Famicom. As we watch the opening cutscene here. From here on out, I'll be referring to the game as Space Megaforce, as that's what it's more commonly known as in the West for the Super Nintendo. Typical shoot 'em up plot. A giant alien ship and force have invaded Earth. We need to battle them to get them off our planet, and then we decide to go into space and follow them back to their homeworld. Now, as we see the pictures of the two pilots here, the interesting thing about this is in the US version of this game, the two pilots are not shown in the cutscene. It skips those two images for some reason. As we see the title screen here, Super Aleste. Honestly, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Maybe it's Aleste, maybe it's Aleste. Anyways, it's a great game. Let's go ahead and get started here. Level 1 is a very friendly level, as it should be in any reasonable shoot 'em up game. It lets you get your bearings, pick up some weapons. I prefer the laser, which is why I was delaying in getting that particular power-up. There are 8 different weapons in the game, numbered 1 through 8. Number 2 is the laser. It's my favorite. There are times when I prefer to use the circle weapon or the homing missile weapon, and you'll see those from time to time. Level 1 is a very accessible inroads into this game and the shooter genre in general. One of the things I give props to Space Megaforce for is the moment you pick up and start playing the game, if you have never played a shoot 'em up game before, you can figure out what's going on and you can at least not feel super overwhelmed. There are a lot of shoot 'em up games that try and overwhelm the player, as I took a hit there. And this one doesn't do that right from the get-go. The shield system in this game is interesting. Every 4 of the orange power-ups you get upgrades your weapon 1 level. Every green power-up upgrades at 1 level. If you pick up the same power-up number that you already have, that also upgrades your weapon a level. But then if you get hit, your weapon goes down a number of levels, to the point that if your weapon is maxed out, you can take 2 hits before your ship explodes. That's pretty typical of compile-developed shoot-'em-up games. So if you play a shoot-'em-up game that uses that system, chances are it was developed by Compile or by people who used to work there. Back in the day, Compile had their hand in a number of shoot-'em-up games, either developed by them or co-developed or ported in some fashion by them. The Aleste series was pretty darn popular in Japan. They made games for the Master System, Game Gear, Sega Genesis, various computer consoles, computer-based consoles. Is the MSX a computer or a console? I never quite understood that. I think technically it's a computer, but most people use it to play games. One of the things I love about this game is, like I said, it's very accessible. And when this game came out in '92, I wasn't really in love with the shoot-'em-up genre. I had played games such as Gradius and R-Type, but I just found them to be quarter munchers. And while I understand challenge is an aspect of a good game, those games kind of ramped up the difficulty level so quick that honestly I never felt encouraged to keep playing them to get better. I think I did actually play through and beat Gradius for the NES begrudgingly, because at the time I didn't have anything else really new to play. But really, this is the first shoot 'em up game that came out that made me sit down and enjoy it and think to myself, you know, I like this genre. I wanna see more of what it's all about. These days, I will play more challenging shoot 'em up games and invest the time to get through them. But back in the day, I wasn't having any of that. Another thing I'd like to point out is just look at how many bullets and ships and everything is on screen. And this game isn't slowing down whatsoever. It's a marvel when you think about it. This was one of the earlier games for the Super Nintendo. Games like Super R-Type and Gradius for the Super Nintendo had major problems with slowdown and flickering and all sorts of just technical problems. And this game has none of that. In recent years, Space Megaforce has become a more sought-after Super Nintendo title. There was a long time where you could get copies of this game for $20, no problem. Unfortunately, when I was younger, probably around 94 or 95, I traded in my copy of the game at Electronics Boutique so I could get something else. I don't know even what I traded it in for. Uh, so that was a mistake on my part, because when I became an older adult and decided, you know, I want to play Space Megaforce again, I had to go out and get a used copy. And by that time, copies of this game were selling for 70, upwards of 70 or $80. And that, you know, at the time I thought that was ridiculous. Flash forward to, you know, 2020 now, and it doesn't look so ridiculous now that copies of this game are selling for 140, 150 easily. And I think a lot of that is just people have in the past bought multiple copies of the game and they're hoarding it. This game was never underproduced. I remember game store shelves back in the day when this one came out. There wasn't a lot of competition. It was early in the Super Nintendo's life, so maybe there was one new game coming out a month or two new games coming out a month. So the fact that the Super Nintendo version of this game is hard to find, it feels artificial. That first boss is kind of a pushover. The main key to beating him is to stay in the middle, which is odd for a shoot 'em up boss. You usually don't want to stay right in the middle, but for the first boss, you do. So back when I picked up this copy of Super Aleste, uh, the US version was going for, like I said, $70, $80. And that was a note from me. But the Japanese version was going for about $30. So I picked up a copy, this copy of Super Aleste for around $30. I think maybe it might have been $35 with shipping and everything factored in. Today, I think it goes for twice that, but it's still half the cost of the US version of the game. So if you want a legit copy, definitely get the Japanese version. The differences are few. This stage shows off the Super Nintendo's rotation and scaling abilities. The stage itself and the final boss are getting larger and larger as it throws everything at you. This battle platform is both the stage and the boss, which is kind of a trope of compile shoot 'em up games. And in fact, if you're a fan of the shoot 'em up genre but haven't played every single shoot 'em up there is, you might have played a compile shoot 'em up and not necessarily realized it. Besides the Aleste series, they had their hand in a number of other games such as Zanak, Blazing Lasers. There's a Japanese shoot-'em-up game by Konami called Crisis Force, which, while it wasn't developed by Compile, clearly was either inspired by or had some former Compile staff developing it, because the similarities are just too much to be coincidence. Even though the circle weapon or the homing missile weapon would be better in some respects on this stage, I do prefer the laser. I'm going to switch to the missiles briefly to show them off. I generally prefer the laser, though, because there are certain enemies on this stage who have shields that only the laser can get through. Speaking of Crisis Force on the 8-bit Famicom, that game was never ported to the Nintendo, which is unfortunate. It's also a game that it's difficult to find reproductions of, or almost impossible, because it used a special chip, so they can't just dump it to a ROM chip and sell you a copy of it. I think it can be emulated, so if you want to play it that way, hey, more power to you. I actually enjoyed Crisis Force for the NES or for the Famicom so much that I bought a copy of it, and I took the copy out of the cartridge and used an old copy of Gyromite to convert it to an NES cartridge, and even had someone make a custom label for me. Don't worry, I didn't sacrifice the Famicom cartridge. I pried it open gently. I still have all the necessary parts to put it back together if I need to. If you're a TurboGrafx or PC Engine fan, Compile developed the two Spriggan games for that system, which are very similar to Compile's Genesis Aleste games, which you might better know as Musha and Robo Aleste. Which at some point I am going to play my copy of Musha and record that, because that game is just awesome. I do feel, however, that Robo Aleste is the better game. I have a copy of that too somewhere. I just don't have any way of playing it right now because my Sega CD died, and when I tried to resurrect it by replacing the capacitors and everything, it still didn't come back to life. Maybe it's a power supply issue in the thing, but currently my Sega CD is dead. It's so awesome to think, though, that this game was responsible for giving me my love for the shoot-'em-up genre. Because of this game, I decided to give games like Aero Fighters, Darius, Earth Defense Force, and Thunder Force, a first and second look. And maybe back then I didn't quite get into those games as much as I am now, but this game is the reason why I gave those games a look. And also why, when arcade shoot-'em-up games would come out, such as Aero Fighters, Aero Fighters 2, Battle Back Raid, Batsugan, trying to think here, ESP Rade, and Guang, and just all sorts of other shoot-'em-up games that I came across, I would just play the hell out of them. Of course, let's not forget, classic shoot-'em-up games like Ikaruga. How can you not love that game? Radiant Silvergun. Blazing Lasers for the TurboGrafx. Soldier Blade for the TurboGrafx. What an excellent game. This stage is short. That dude that was flying around is actually the boss of the stage. He bugs you a couple times and then he F's right off. One of the things I love about this game is just the progression of stages. As we're in hyperspace here where physics act weird, the people who designed the stages for this game clearly did their research into astrophysics. Maybe it's not the most realistic, but there's definitely a cadence to the game's stages that have a certain sci-fi tinted realism to them. So you start off in the skies above planet Earth. Then you're going through the solar system where basically it's empty space. I'll switch to the circle weapon here. This weapon is pretty darn decent for this stage. And then you're in deeper space, and then you're in hyperspace, so you can cross the galaxy faster, and eventually you find yourself, in an asteroid field, and then going through alien worlds until you finally reach the final boss. And since there aren't any story scenes or anything like that, it's nice that at least the progression of the stages tell a story if you're willing to infer it. I always thought these shrinking and growing planetoids were ridiculous. But let's face it, hyperspace is funny. We learned that from Babylon 5, didn't we? By the way, if you've never seen Babylon 5 and you are a fan of Deep Space Nine, you need to watch that series and just realize how awesome it is. Also, just for the record, Deep Space Nine was a total ripoff of Babylon 5. You can look up the history of it. I don't like being a sci-fi elitist there, but man, I love me some Babylon 5. I don't find this weapon very useful, but it is nice to be able to unleash a shot that covers most of the screen. On this stage, I think the circle weapon and the homing missiles are preferred. There are some spots, though, clearly where the laser would have served me better, but thankfully I had the ship that respawned right in the same spot. If you'll notice in the lower right corner, that ship icon is orange. When the ship icon is orange, that means that when you lose a life, you'll respawn exactly where you are. If it's not orange, it will take you back a checkpoint so that you can gather some more power-ups. I tend to be a fan of shoot-'em-up games that let you respawn immediately where you are, but I do think this game offers a good balance. If you're doing well and you have tons of power-ups, then it'll start you right off where you are because, you have it figures you have the skill to handle it and get back on track. But again, if you lose too many ships that way, it'll kick you back a checkpoint and throw some extra power-ups at you to hopefully give you your bearings back. It's awesome that they were thinking of that. Compile definitely put some thought into the balance of this game. You got to give them credit, too. Like I said, this was one of the first games to come out for the Super Nintendo. So they could have half-assed it and sold plenty of copies. But they didn't half-ass it. They made a game that stood the test of time. This boss can be a pain. He often takes up a lot of the screen, forcing you to cut the razor's edge through his component parts. The laser weapon is definitely best against him. It's the only weapon that can really cut through his shielding. Oh, that's a bad spot for me to be in. I got lucky there. Or maybe it was skill. Maybe I knew that's where I needed to be. You don't know. There are 12 stages to this game. I don't know if I'm going to get through them all. I just basically plan to play until I run out of ships. This stage can be a challenge. I'm hopefully going to pick up the... as I lose a ship there. I'm hopefully going to pick up the homing missile weapon, which I prefer for this stage. The laser weapon is pretty good if it's powered up. Right now it's not, though. There we go, homing missiles, that's what I wanted. This stage is very reminiscent of a stage in Konami's Crisis Force, which, as I mentioned, is worth picking up even though it's a 8-bit Famicom exclusive game. That game pushes out so many bullets, and the graphical clarity is so much that at times it looks like a Sega Genesis game. I wouldn't go so far to say it looks like a Super Nintendo game, but there are times when Crisis Force looks like a Sega Genesis game. This stage looks very similar to a stage in that game. Now, Crisis Force came out in '95, so clearly that game was inspired by this one. Although I would go so far as to say it was somehow developed by, if not developed by Compile, someone that previously had worked for Compile. The similarities are just too great to be a coincidence. From everything I've read and from the credits that are in the game, it was developed in-house by Konami, but either they took great homage to this game, or somebody who was working on that project had helped develop this game. And my instinct of picking up the laser did not serve me very well there. Let's go back to getting the homing missiles. One thing I like about this game is, for the most part, collision with the scenery will not kill your ship. Now, small projectiles and bullets will hurt your ship, but the scenery generally won't. The main exception to that is in the asteroid field stage, which is going to be coming up soon. For whatever reason, they decided in that stage that Some of the larger asteroids are not actually scenery, but they are projectiles. Which is a lesson you learn very quickly as you're playing this game. Trying to focus more on the gameplay right now than the speaking, because I messed up and didn't exactly grab the weapon that I want to have. And so I'm trying to get through this stage without losing too many ships. Now, even though the Super Nintendo wasn't known as a console that could push a ton of sprites, and didn't have a lot of what I would call spectacular shoot-'em-up games on it, it did have a number of good shoot-'em-ups. As I lose a ship there. One of my favorites, which has really gone up in price over the years, is Aero Fighters, also known as Sonic Wings. A port of the arcade game Aero Fighters. I think actually it was a port of the second Aero Fighters game. Can't quite remember. Anyways, Aero Fighters for the Super Nintendo is definitely worth picking up. However, nowadays copies of it sell for many hundreds of dollars. So I would suggest if you want a legit copy of that, look into getting the Super Famicom version of Sonic Wings. Or just skipping it entirely and getting the arcade / Neo Geo versions that are available in the various eShops that are out there. You can get Aero Fighters 2, and there are also games similar to them called the Strikers series, which are also worth playing. But the reason why I mention Aero Fighters is when that game came out for the Super Nintendo, it was kind of like a an echo chamber in a way. I had this game, and then I traded it away for something, and then Aero Fighters came out, and I played the hell out of that game, and history repeated itself. I traded in my copy of Aero Fighters for something else. I think at the time I might have traded it for something for the Saturn, so probably a Capcom fighting game, so at the time, not really a loss. But how was I to know that Aero Fighters was, one of the rarest Super Nintendo games ever made? Oops. In fairness, when Aero Fighters came out, it wasn't difficult to find a copy, and even after the Super Nintendo kind of lost favor and was replaced by the 32-bit systems, you could still get a copy of Aero Fighters real cheap. Like, we're talking $15, $20 cheap. But that's not the case these days. So now if I want to buy a legit copy of Aero Fighters, I'm going to be investing, so to speak, in a copy. Which I'm not going to do. That would just be ridiculous. This is another of those short palate cleanser levels. One of the other things I like about this game is it does alternate the longer stages with the shorter ones. And it'll throw in a hard stage and an easy stage to help you get your bearings. This is probably one of the most accessible shoot-'em-up games that was ever made, period. Beginners can play it and get better and enjoy it. Experts can play through the first half of the game and then really be challenged by the latter half of the game, as we're in the asteroid field level, which is very reminiscent of an NES game called Gun Knack, which is another shoot-'em-up game that's become pricey in recent years. Gun Knack is a trip anyways because you're fighting against giant bunny rabbits who throw carrot missiles at you, and there's one level that throws everything in the kitchen sink at you, and literally it starts throwing sinks at you. I would say if you're watching this video and you're thinking to yourself, that's an awesome game, I want to play it, well, first you should definitely do so. Again, Super Aleste / Space Megaforce for the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo. But also, take a look at Compile's other shooter games. Musha for the Sega Genesis, also known as Musha Aleste for the Mega Drive. Robo Aleste for the Sega CD. If you have a Turbo CD or a PC Engine CD, Spriggan and Spriggan Mark II. I feel like the first game in that series was better than the second. I would have to go back and replay them. And then, of course, Blazing Lasers, which is so similar to this game it hurts. It's an awesome game. And then, even though it wasn't developed by Compile, Soldier Blade for the TurboGrafx, also awesome. You're looking for more modern shoot-'em-up games. If you look in the PS4 and Xbox One eShop, you can find Battle Gorega sitting in there, which is tough as nails, but awesome. Axiom Verge, that's another good one. Ikaruga, of course, which I think is available for everything. Can't go wrong with Ikaruga. I think it's pretty self-evident why I prefer the laser weapon. It just cuts through so much. Also, generally speaking, when playing a shoot 'em up game, I would suggest not using your bombs very often, but this one is different. In this one, I would say if you feel the need to use your bombs, definitely do so. This stage can be a real challenge if you don't have the laser or circle weapon. It just throws so much at you. And it's kind of like night and day. If you have the laser or the circle weapon, you get through this stage pretty easy. If you don't, it is a very sad day indeed. Again, taking advantage of the Super Nintendo's scaling and warping effects. And these were pretty interesting effects back in the day. We hadn't seen them before. This boss, for the most part, does not take very much damage. He's kind of a stay alive and wait for the actual main portion of the boss to appear kind of deal. You'll notice it's just throwing every power up at me as that you can fathom, which is much appreciated. Say the only drawback to this game, especially back in the day, was it doesn't have a two-player mode. But then, given what they did to make it so that this game didn't have any slowdown or flickering, I can understand why. And also, when this game came out, it was very rare for Super Nintendo games to have a two-player mode. I mean, we have to remember that Final Fight, when it came out, didn't have a two-player mode, and that's a game that should have had a two-player mode. So I don't really have any stories of playing this game with people because, there was never a way to play cooperatively. Uh, my friends used to borrow this game all the time, though. Which was great, because if a particular game came out and I couldn't afford to get it or I bought something else instead, I could let them borrow this game for a month or two and I could play something new. That's how we had to do it back in the day when, games cost so much. I mean, if you think about it, back in the day, games still cost $50 or $60, but $50 or $60 was a lot more back then than it is now, inflation being the way it is. Interestingly, Compile is the company that created the Puyo Puyo series of puzzle games. Sega owns the rights to that license, but they're the ones who created it. And the reason why I find that interesting is there's times in this game where it feels more like a puzzle game than a shoot 'em up game. There are just spots where you can listen to the music and chill out and kind of put your brain on autopilot. I don't think I'm getting that bomb. That's unfortunate. This is a stage 2 where you don't want to lose too many lives just because it's very difficult to rebuild your weapons. And the shrapnel that comes out at you is very untimely. Which, like I said, in this stage is not a good thing. The odds of me getting through this level now are pretty slim. Ugh. That shrapnel is just so unpredictable sometimes. I mean, I guess I could try going through the stage without shooting anything. That would minimize the amount of shrapnel I'd have to deal with. But where's the fun in that? Ah. Yeah, this stage is going to be the end of me. That's okay, though. I do want to thank you guys for sticking around and watching as I play through Space Megaforce for the Super Nintendo. Or, as I said in the beginning, my copy of Super Aleste for the Super Famicom. I think actually I'm going to leave the stream here. I think it's pretty obvious I'm not going to make it through this stage. I just don't have the right... I didn't come in with the right balance of weapons. So, with that, I'm going to wish you guys a good day, good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this. And I hope you'll tune in for future videos, some of which will be more shoot-'em-up games, and many of which won't. Until next time, see ya!